I like sequels. Not everyone does. A lot of people see them as companies cashing in on certain franchises, and there are a lot of times when they're right. But those aren't the sequels I like. I like sequels that take the older games, introduce new mechanics, expand on old ones, and just make everything smoother and more fun. Of course, this doesn't happen with every series. A bad sequel fails to improve on anything the first game provided, as if the developers didn't understand what made the first game good and used this misunderstanding to craft the second game. Devil May Cry 2 easily comes to mind here. An alright sequel just gives us more of the same. You look at it and while it's still a good game, you really can't tell it apart from the first one. A good sequel brings new ideas to the table and refines some of the gameplay, but some of these ideas could introduce new problems or just suck in general. On the flip side, a good sequel could change too much, and while it does improve many things, it's wildly different from the previous game and you can't objectively say which is better. However, a perfect sequel improves every part of the original game while fixing major problems and maintaining the franchise's style. You play the game and have no doubt in your mind that everything is better this time around. A perfect sequel doesn't have to be a perfect game, nor does it have to come from a good game for it to be great. By all means, a great game will produce an even greater perfect sequel, but even a bad game can have sequels that are fantastic. I don't know how many times I finished playing a game and said to myself, there are a lot of neat ideas here, but it doesn't work out well. With the next game, they'll really be able to impress me. Today's game and its sequel illustrate my point exactly. Zone of the Enders would have faded into the PS2's immense library of mediocrity if not for the fact that the game shipped with a demo for Metal Gear Solid 2. It would have performed poorly without that demo, since this game is short and not great. In Zone of the Enders, you play as Leo, a child who finds a super powerful mech named Jehudi, and he's a real good pilot because he's the protagonist and he has to be. While his space colony is under attack, Leo is asked to bring Jehudi back to its owners. The story focuses mainly on Leo losing his innocence by being forced to kill people to complete his mission, but the theme is lost due to how much time he spends whining. It's hard to relate with Leo because he's a nobody. No one likes him, he complains about everything, and he's only doing what everyone tells him to because it makes him feel useful. His only real friend is Jehudi's AI, Ada, who also thinks Leo sucks.
Illogical actions by persons without sufficient capabilities make it very difficult to fulfill the mission.
You mean I'm not good enough to do this, so I should just shut up and obey orders?
That is the most sensible course.
Ada's great. Even though she's just an AI, she's the only enjoyable character because her logical way of thinking is hilarious when contrasted with Leo's irrationality. Anyway, one of the big problems with Zone of the Enders is that there is not a whole lot of story. About 90% of the game is spent returning Jehudi to the good guys. Once Leo does manage to meet up with the people giving him orders, he has one last fight with the bad guy, then another battle with the leader of the bad guys, which you can't win, and then the game ends on a cliffhanger. And not a particularly gripping one either. By the end of the game, you don't like any of the characters and very little of the world has been explained to you. You don't know much about the guys you've been fighting all this time, and the only villain you really see and talk with is presented as a psychopath, which isn't relatable at all. So when you get to the end of the game and you're presented with this cliffhanger, you don't care about what's going to happen next. The second major problem with Zone of the Enders is the game's length. It takes 4 hours to beat the game. But wait, not a whole lot happens in the story. It should only take an hour to cover all of this material. So where do the other 3 hours come from? Diversions. Most of your time is not spent advancing the story. It's spent overcoming hurdles that are preventing you from handing over Jehudi to its owners. The first hurdle is this giant barrier which you have to shut down by destroying generators, which you can't do until you run around the colony and find specific weapons and items. Then once you kill the barrier, you have to fix Jehudi because you got infected with a virus while trying to shut down the barrier. By the time you finish the main objective, there's only 10 minutes of gameplay left. If you took the diversions out of the game, what you'd be left with is basically a demo with some story added to it. Did I mention Konami made this? The gameplay is definitely better. Zone of the Enders is a mech-based hack-and-slash game with fast, simple combat. You attack with a sword at close range and shoot enemies when farther away. You can charge up energy for either a slower, wider, and more powerful slash or charge up for a volleyball serve. For its last attack, Jehudi fires multiple lasers that home in on enemies, which looks cool, but is kinda weak. Since all of the combat takes place in the air, enemies can come at you from any angle, so you have to make use of these fast dodges to avoid attacks and corner enemies. Even with all this movement on screen, the camera manages to keep up and stay out of your way, and though that should be expected, with how fast this game is, it's worth pointing out. Every area you come to has several groups of enemies patrolling around, but there are only 3 types of enemies, and they are all handled the same way. No foe will force you to change your tactics when fighting them, and it becomes boring soon enough. Higher level enemies do act smarter and make more attempts to dodge and block in response to your attacks, but they're all still easy, even on hard mode. Jehudi also has sub-weapons, such as a long-range javelin, geyser, which can stun enemies, and halberd, which is just a laser. I found myself ignoring these most of the time since the weapons themselves are lackluster. Halberd and Decoy are the best ones, Halberd because it's really powerful and Decoy because it's good for tricking enemies. The rest are either too slow or too weak to warrant my attention, and that's a shame because variety is what keeps games like these fun. What Zone of the Enders lacks in varied enemies, it makes up for in great bosses. But not this boss. This one's a tease, and not even a good kind of tease where you get overpowered by a boss and then come back hours later and trash them. The game shines with all of the other bosses. They're usually huge, look like an aquatic animal, have multiple forms, and really change how you move around and fight. Unlike regular enemies, you can only damage bosses in certain weak spots, so you have to focus more on your movement in battle, and their attacks are designed to get you to move around a lot. The best fights are the ones against Viola, because her mech is just like yours. It's small, it's fast, and it has similar attacks. Watching her and Jehudi dash around each other is awesome. It plays as fun as it looks, but I'm also biased in this regard. My favorite times in the hack and slash genre are when they put you in a one-on-one against someone who is just as powerful as you are. No gimmicks, no cheap tactics, just a pure test of skill. Zone of the Enders isn't bad. It's fine if you want to slash at robots and blow off steam for a while, but once you get into the diversions where nothing you do impacts the story, the game gets boring. I feel like if the story was better paced, if it had more going on, and if the gameplay was more developed, I'd be confident in giving it a worth playing rating. It's just below the threshold for me and sits in the try it if you really want to, but just don't bother tier of games. However, Zone of the Enders, The Second Runner, is a perfect sequel. The Second Runner came out 2 years after the original and likewise takes place 2 years after the events of that story. Despite all the hubbub about getting Jehudi into the hands of the good guys, they somehow lost it, so pretty much nothing that happened in the last game mattered. You don't play as Leo this time, but instead play as Dingo Egret, a miner with the coolest name who finds Jehudi on one of Jupiter's moons. He ends up piloting it after Bahram, the bad guys from the first game, attack his mining site. After tearing through their weak assault, Dingo ends up getting wrecked by Noman, the guy who also beats you up at the end of the first game. Noman wants Dingo to join forces with him, and when Dingo refuses, he gets shot. Another pilot saves Dingo by using Jehudi as life support, and they have to work together to stop Noman from killing everybody with his super weapon. All of this happens in just the first 20 minutes of the game, too. The Second Runner's intro is essentially a well-paced rehashing of the plot of the last game, but with better characters and just more plot. This intro manages to teach us more about the setting and characters than the entirety of the first game could. Even the game's cliffhanger ending is presented better in the sequel. In the first game, it's revealed that Jehudi's mission is to go to Noman's superweapon and self-destruct. It means very little because Jehudi is a machine. You can build another. In the Second Runner, it has a lot of meaning since Dingo needs Jehudi to survive, and we're invested in his story because he's a much better protagonist than Leo. Dingo's goals actually conflict with each other, since he wants revenge against Noman and has to help out the Space Force to get his body back, but doing that would also mean blowing up with Jehudi. The story is more engaging and intriguing, and since everything you do in-game is relevant to the plot, the pacing is much better. Everything about the gameplay is also better, even down to the graphics. Somehow in the first game, all of the pre-rendered cutscenes ended up looking worse than a normal game. The developers rectified this by having all characters appear in 2D, but have all of the action appear in 3D. Aside from just looking better, this change also gives the game a unique style, which I really like. The simplest way I can describe how the Second Runner improves its gameplay is to take the first game and speed it up by about 30%. Jehudi has the same attacks and weapons as in the first game, but everything is snappier and faster. A couple attacks were changed for the better, such as the charge attack, which you can actually charge now. You also shoot way more lasers with your homing attack, and you can grab enemies and either use them as weapons or spin them around incredibly fast for a powerful throw. A couple spectacular boss fights revolve around grabbing objects, and they not only teach you the different uses of the grab, but they also teach you to look to your surroundings to gain advantages, which makes good use of the level design. Now there are a lot of enemy types that engage you in various ways. You really don't want to get grabbed by a Clod, and why bother hitting each of these swarmers individually when a giant homing laser will wipe them all out? These new enemies make your sub-weapons useful, and Ada will even offer to switch weapons for you when the situation calls for it. The weapons also got small changes to make them faster, stronger, and overall more efficient. There's a stronger reliance on sub-weapons in this game, so the gameplay always manages to feel fresh as different enemy setups have you rotate through your different weapons. That's just excellent game design. New to the game are several big set pieces which sharply increase the game's scope. Everyone who's beaten the game remembers taking down warships with the Vector Cannon, or fighting in this big war with your comrades. Or maybe you remember Zakat, who's just a throwback to the first game's huge boss fights. Large increases in scope like these are what make games memorable, and I find it fun to see how developers can push the PS2 to its limits. All of the bosses are still great, and there's a lot of them, so many that you end up fighting 3 just in the intro to the game. The recurring fights against Noman and Viola are also good, since each time you fight, one of the battle's key mechanics is altered. I love fighting Anubis, since the first time you fight him, you're really weak and can't match his speed or his power. But as you level up and as Jehudi evolves and grows stronger, you gain more ground on Anubis, and eventually it all culminates in a battle that is as intense skillfully as it is visually. I love the Second Runner. While Zone of the Enders is fun, the minimal story and lack of refined mechanics wear down on that fun very quickly, and its conclusion is unsatisfying. But its sequel, which is super fast and keeps you engaged with both its story and gameplay, while being roughly the same length, is amazing. Without a doubt, it's worth playing and fully deserves to be called a perfect sequel.